Hey, this is Mrs. Rycroft, and I'm here to talk to you today about the Anthology B piece, A Hero, written by R.K. Narayan, about a young man called Swami and his accidental slip into heroism. So let's get on, shall we? So, a little bit about R.K. Narayan himself. He died in 2001 at the age of 95. Well, you can see there I've included his full name, which I'm not even going to try and bend my mouth around, but you can see that where the RK and his surname Narayan came from. So if you can see it there, see Narayan. He was born in Madras in India. It's now called Chennai, and he's one of the three Indian writers who are credited with bringing the idea of Indian storytelling to the world of literature. Narayan writes in English. It's his first language. He was educated at home by his grandmother, who insisted that they spoke English in the home as much as possible. He invented the small town of Malgudi, where the story is set in particular, but there are also lots of other short stories he's written about the population of that town. He's created a whole little setting. Malgudi is a fictional town, as I said, but it's set in South India. So, as you can see on the screen there are a few book covers there, so you've got some idea of how prolific he is. He's written an awful lot, so I would encourage you to extend your reading and to extend your learning, and read a few more short stories by him, maybe even a novel or two. There's one called The English Teacher, which is also one of the set texts on lots of GCSE courses. I would suggest you read A Horse and Two Goats, because that story particularly always makes me laugh, and everybody loves to laugh, right? So, the first thing we're going to do when we walk our way through this is we're going to look at Skazi and think about what elements are there. But to extend your thinking and push yourself into that A and A star bracket, you also want to think about what's not there. So think about what the author's left out, and think about why those gaps have been created, what that does to the poem or to the play, or in this case to the short story. Think about pearl structure as you go. So as you pick up a point, think about what you would use for each element of pearl as you make notes. If you make notes in this form, then it's going to be easy for you to remember what to do as you're planning to write an essay style answer. So let's get on, shall we? Skazi. You all know that stands for setting, character, action, style and idea, right? But how do we apply that to the way we study a short story? So let's have a look. First thing we would think about are the kind of ideas that we might want to end up with. So where might we want to be with the end of all of this? I'd think about issues and themes that are presented. With this particular story, I'd definitely think about what the writer's saying about families and family relationships and inter-family relationships. We'd also think about what's being foregrounded about the idea of bravery or even fear, and thinking about what the writer himself is revealing. If you think back a few moments, I was telling you that the writer was educated by his grandmother. I don't think there's any coincidence that Swami is also particularly close to his grandmother. There might be a little autobiographical element to Swami's life here, but I'll leave you to decide upon that and think it over. Okay, so we think about the action. Think about how pace is created and how tension's created. Think about sentence lengths and things like that. Also think about what you notice about the way dialogue and narrative and description are used and interwoven to create a full piece. Think about how Narayan builds his story and how he creates an exciting moment. Think about the way that tone is used. Think about how it changes through the piece. All of these Anthology B pieces have a change of tone as you read through the short story, but think about why that happens, and think about what an author does to create that change. Okay, is it word choice? Is it sentence length? Is it the semantic field? There's a lot of different things you could look into. The next thing I want you to think about is how characters are presented. So think about what devices are used to make characterization work, and think about how those devices work on the reader. Is it humour? Is it morality? Is it ethics? Is it serious? Is it light-hearted? Think carefully about how each character responds to the situation they're presented with, and then consider why the author would choose to do that. Think about what the effect of all these choices are on the reader. Okay, so next I want you to think about setting. Setting here is particularly specific. It's a South Indian fictional village. So think about how that affects the way we respond to the story and the themes that it presents and the characters that are created within it. For some of us, we might have a lot of knowledge of this cultural context, and for others, very little. So what you need to consider is how Narayan has conveyed that difference in setting, and how he has conveyed the idea of culture, and how he has conveyed the idea of society. Okay? With me so far? Pause and rewind if you need to, or pause and catch up with the notes. Okay, let's take a step on. Let's think a little bit more about style now. So if I was going to think about style, the first thing I would think about was actually this is quite a funny story. So I would look for the moments of comedy and humour in the text, and I would ask myself how they're created, why they're created, and what effect do they have on the reader. I'd look specifically for language devices that were used in comedy, and I would look for the way that, particularly with this piece, the direct speech and the description creates humour. The next thing I would think about was, why does the author do it? Why does Narayan want us to find it light-hearted and entertaining? Who are we supposed to be laughing at, and who are we supposed to be laughing with? And why do we think that's the case? Think about why the writer has created any tension, particularly in the section where Swami is in his father's office and the burglar is coming through the window. It's both funny and tense at the same time. And think about how structural or language shifts, semantic fields are changed to affect the way that tone and style is created. Altogether, when you put that back into one little package, you want to think about what the effect is on the reader. So all the way through, although you're looking at what happens in the piece, you're constantly thinking about what Narayan wants the reader to get out of reading his story. What is he trying to say? How do you know? And why is it there? Okay, so the next one to think about a little bit is character. So character is quite interesting because there are quite a lot of characters in this. For a short story, there's definitely a lot of characters, and they're all very well developed. You could probably almost see them in your mind's eye. I know I certainly can. So I want to think about how these characters are presented, and I know that Swami and his father are the main characters realistically, so I would want to think about how the father is presented. I think he's presented quite unsympathetic and quite harsh, and he's trying to force his son to grow up, and think about the way that Swami responds to that. I'd also think about whether Swami is actually a hero. He's an accidental hero, isn't he? What he does isn't done through any sense of duty or the desire to protect his family. It kind of happens by accident, and he's again too much of a coward to actually put anybody straight. So think about why that might have happened and what Narayan wants to say about the nature of young boys and their fathers. Okay, so when you're writing about all of that, what you need to constantly refer to are the language devices and the structure that are used. So you need to think about what devices the writer uses to create characterization in all of these pieces of writing, but specifically in this, it's very, very clear. You want to think about the way they behave, the values that they demonstrate, and the relationships that are built. You could even think about events in terms of characterization. It's not impossible. You want to think about the main characters. So we have Swami's father and Swami himself, and then Swami's grandmother, Swami's mother, who makes a very small entrance, and the burglar himself. I think about how sorry you might possibly feel for the father, who is caught. In fact, both the father and Swami are caught between these two women, and at one stage the mother says that she's not going to get in the way, but then she gets in the way. So have a think about why that's all happening. Next thing I want you to think about is action. So think about how the action is created. Specifically, think about pace. How does Narayan create the pace in his piece of writing? He does an awful lot which creates snap and punch, and a lot of that is done through the way he uses sentence structure and that sentence techniques. He also does a lot of it with direct, straight, bold sentences with direct speech. So think about both of those things and think about how the pace and the tension is created and broken and how it's then built up again. So the things you might want to think about is how quickly events move on and how you know that the events are moving on quickly. Thinking about the specific writing choices, specific word choices and techniques that the author uses, and think about why the narrative structure comes to an ending the way that it does. Do you find it a particularly comedic ending? Does the whole piece leave you with a bit of a wry smile on your face? Have a little think about what's going on there. And then think about whether all of these language choices and the pace and the tone have an effect on the reader, have an effect on the narrative of the story, and have an effect on the creation of character. Last thing to think about now is setting. So I'd want to think about how the setting of a southern Indian village affects our response to the story specifically, the themes that it shows and the characters within it. I think about what you might learn about the region and its people from the way this short story is written, and then I would ask myself how and why is it done. So think about the imagery and the description that are used, how it conveys a sense of time and place, and how the cultural and specific language happen. I want you to think about contractions and think about how many shortenings, informal shortenings, happen in the direct speech. I'm not going to say any more, but I want you to consider what's going on, and as you're revising, definitely think about it. Now we're on to the last bit, the ideas. So again, as I said in the beginning, what we need to think about is the issues that Narayan wants us to consider. He's talking to us an awful lot about the way the family and their relationships function. Think about how that might relate to his early life. Again, the assessment objective doesn't ask you specifically to write that, but it contextualizes and informs your response. Think about the notion of bravery and think about the other things that Narayan is foregrounding for us to consider. Then think about how and why it's used and how and why we know what culture is being used. Think about how it's represented and why he has chosen to use that particular setting. Okay. Final thing to think about is the word choices on an individual level and phrasing level, and think about the structures and think about all of the clues that Narayan gives us. Right. So, if we want to sum up to revise this, the thing you have to remember is that this tests AO2, and it's printed there as a second bullet point on the screen, and that this is an English language paper. So we're not looking at the literary merit of this. What we're looking at is word choice and sentence structure and language devices that are used, and how Narayan puts that all together to convey a point. You will not get a very good mark if you just reiterate the story, so don't bother to do it. It's a waste of time and energy. Remember that the marking examiner has read this story lots of times, knows it really well. You don't need to retell them exactly what's happened. You really don't, so please don't. Okay, things that you could write about when you're writing about this text. You could consider what a question could ask you. You know how it's structured because it asks you to consider language, form and structure. So think about how the writer might convey a certain element, a theme or a motif in the story. If you think about this particular short story in terms of fear, consider what you might write about. Think about what you might use when you're planning. Think about how you would structure this with your Pearl planning. Think about what you would say to open it, and think about how you would sum your ideas up. To practice, there is no better strategy than doing your own practice questions and marking them, or swapping with a friend and having a friend mark it for you. Easy, straightforward, and practice genuinely does make perfect. So, things I chose. I thought about the first conversation, and I thought about how the relationship between Swami and his father is set up. Remember, we're talking about fear here. I thought about how Swami shows respect but doesn't believe that story that he's shown, and I wondered why Narayan wanted me to think about this, and I wondered how he made me think it. And of course I picked out word choice because, you know, it's one of the main things we need to write about after all. The next thing I thought about was how his father initially makes it look like a what would you do type of conversation, but ultimately he's using it to bully Swami about sleeping beside his grandmother in the hallway. I know it's bullying rather than just a father trying to say to his son, hey, you're getting a bit old for this, time to grow up, because there's word choice. If you look fixedly at someone, when someone stares at you and really won't let you off the hook. So, got the idea of that? Easy, right? So, All you have to do is go away and make up your own questions and have a go. If you want the mark scheme, you can find it on the VLE or Edmodo if your teacher has an Edmodo classroom. Good luck, and don't forget you can pop along and ask me anything you want to ask me about this short story anytime you like. I'm only an email away, guys. Good luck and happy revision.